The gun was still warm when Kvetrin reported to it. He felt the heat through the deck plating before he saw the turret itself. A dry, metallic warmth rising through the soles of his boots, the kind of heat a thing gives off hours after it has stopped being used hard. The gun deck of the Terran line monitor culverin stretched away from him in both directions, a cathedral of girders and hoist trunks and yellow-painted warning rings, and at the center of Frame 9 stood Turret 3, 4 stories of weathered gray armor with 3 rail barrels run out toward the void doors, and stenciled on its barbette in chipped white paint, in letters older than Kvet himself, a single word, mule. 2 humans were carrying a stretcher down from the turret's crew hatch. There was a man on it. There was a flag over the man. Kvet stood at the foot of the ladder with his transfer chit in one hand and his duffel in the other, and the humans carrying the stretcher went past him without a word, and that was how Kvetrin learned that he was not joining a gun crew. He was replacing a piece of one. "You the Sathari?" The voice came from above him, from the open hatch. The human leaning out of it had a face like a hull plate, scarred, scorched in one long streak along the jaw, and the eyes set in it were the flat gray of unpainted steel. The man's coveralls said Halloran R. over the left pocket and Chief Gunner's mate under that, and his hands, hanging loose over the hatch combing, were the largest hands Kvet had ever seen on a living being. "Loader 3rd Class Kvetrin," Kvet said. His translator collar flattened the music out of his own name and made it sound like 2 stones knocking together. "Accord Levy. Posting order 11 stroke. I can read," Halloran said. "Get up here." The inside of the turret was smaller than Kvet had imagined, and hotter than he had feared. 6 stations were packed around the breeches of 3 railguns the way organs pack around a spine. Trainer's seat, gun captain's chair, gunner's console, rammer's well, hoist gate, and the loader's cage. His cage now a half-circle of padded rail beside the center breech where a being stood for an entire watch and fed a gun that never said thank you. The air smelled of ozone, machine grease, scorched insulation, and underneath all of it something organic and human. Sweat worked into 40 years of padding. 4 humans turned to look at him and did not say anything at all. Kvet's species read rooms through their hearing membranes, and what his membranes told him about that silence nearly sent him back down the ladder. It was not hostility exactly, it was worse. It was grief with nowhere to go, looking for a place to put itself down. "This is Rin," Halloran said. "He's Sumi's relief." "He's nobody's relief," said the woman in the gunner's seat. Her tag read Ives M. She was small and wire-built, and she did not look at Kvet when she said it. She looked at the loader's cage, at the worn place on the rail, where another set of hands had rested for 11 years. "He's a body in a cage. Sumi doesn't get relieved. Sumi gets replaced because the Navy doesn't leave a gun short and the gun doesn't care who feeds it." "Ives," Halloran said. "I said it to his face, Chief, not behind his back." She looked at Kvet then, and her eyes were red-rimmed and perfectly steady. "Nothing personal, loader. You'll get my whole courtesy. You just don't get his place. You get a place. You see the difference." "I see the difference," Kvet said. "Good," said the enormous man in the rammer's well. "Decker," the tag said, and nothing else about him said anything. He had the stillness of heavy machinery between cycles. "Then you're smarter than the last 3 things the levy sent us." That was the whole welcome. 30 seconds later, Halloran had him in the cage with his hands on the loading tray, and the first lesson of his life aboard culverin began, while the stretcher with the flag on it was still somewhere in the passageways below. And that, Kvet would understand much later, was not coldness. That was the only mercy the gun deck knew how to offer, work immediately and plenty of it. The shell came up through the hoist gate riding a cradle of brass rollers, 190 centimeters of machined tungsten and ablative, jacket 840 kilograms dead weight, and the cage's power assist took most of that. But most was not all, and the loader took the rest with wrists and back, and a rhythm Halloran counted out loud the way Kvet's own people counted out threshing songs. "Seat the shell, check the seat, clear the tray, call it clear." Hands behind the line before the breech screw turned, because the breech screw did not check whether your hands were behind the line. "Again," Halloran said. He did it again. Drill shell, dummy charge, 41 times that first watch, until his arms shook and his hearing membranes were slick against his skull, and Halloran stood over him the whole time with those flat gray eyes and corrected 1 thing per cycle, never 2. "Elbow, stance, call louder. The gun can't hear you, but I have to. And someday it'll be soot and screaming in here, and your call will be the only thing between Decker's arm and the screw." "Why do you still do this with bodies?" Kvet asked, when the watch finally broke. He asked it honestly. Everything he knew about Terran rail monitors said the loading cycle could run fully automated, and everything he had just done with his back said the same thing louder. Machines load faster. The other crew members were filing toward the hatch. Every one of them stopped. "Machines load faster," Halloran agreed. right up until they don't. The Kindled know exactly how to make a machine stop wanting to fight. Him code in the fire control net, Ember static on the power bus, those barge saints of theirs crawling around the hoist trunks, cutting whatever bleeds electrons. He put one huge hand flat on the center breech, an oddly gentle gesture, the way one of Cavet's uncles might touch a draft animal. A loader with a shell in his arms doesn't stop. The day everything else on this ship is dead and dark, Mule still fires every 90 seconds. That's not romance, loader. That's the doctrine of the gun line, and it's written in arithmetic, and the arithmetic is the only reason anyone is left alive between here and the hollow reaches to write anything at all. Cavet looked at the breach under that scarred hand. Up close, the metal carried hairline engraving, and he had assumed it was maintenance scoring until this moment, when he saw the marks resolve into rows of small, neat letters. Names, dozens of names, struck in the breech ring by hand, some of them so old they had been polished back to ghost by 4 decades of gun gas. The newest one still had bright edges. Sumarno, A, and under it the abbreviation the humans used, which Cavet's collar rendered flatly as, he fed the gun. Memorize where the line is, Halloran said and went down the ladder. Culverin held station at the Velvet Cross, and the Velvet Cross was the reason everyone aboard her would shortly be asked to die well. Cavet had crossed it on the way in, the way 2.3 million other beings were trying to cross it now, and from the inside of a transport it had been nothing. A few hours of strange gravity and a view of 2 dead stars. From Culverin's gun deck galleries, with a tactical plot in front of him, he finally saw it whole, and his membranes flattened against his skull at the size of what one ship had been asked to stand under. 2 burned-out stellar cores orbited each other in the deep black between regions, and their interlocked gravity wells did something to the slip lanes that Cavet's schooling had only ever called convenient. 4 great transit lanes, the only practical roads between the core worlds and the whole panhandle of settled space called the hollow reaches, bent toward the dead pair, braided through the shallows of their gravity, and crossed. One junction, one crossing point, perhaps 11,000 kilometers wide, where all 4 lanes ran together over the dead stars like roads over a mountain pass. Everything went through it, grain, ore, medicine, mail. And now, streaming through it day and night in convoys that never ended, the evacuation, 4,100 civilian hulls, every ship the hollow reaches had, carrying everyone who could be carried, because behind them, 11 days out and closing without hurry, came the procession. Cavet had grown up on the stories the way human children grew up on tides and weather. The Kindled did not raid, did not conquer, did not negotiate. They believed the stars were embers of a first holy fire, and that every world which refused their creed was fuel hoarded against the faith, and fuel existed to burn. Their fleet was called the Procession of the Last Ember, and it was not a navy. It was a liturgy with engines. 1,118 consecrated hulls moving in a sacred order that had not broken, turned, or stopped in 206 years. Lectorships that sang their sermons across open channels until defending crews' own equipment prayed back. Votive rams the size of cathedrals with their crews fused into the steering shrines. Pyre carriers whose only cargo was fire for the worlds that said no, and at the heart of the formation, the font of embers, the rolling reliquary fortress that carried their living saint, whose title Cavet's grandmother had only ever spoken in a whisper with her hands over her ears, the Ember Keeper. 6 border worlds had said no to the procession in 2 centuries, all 6 were glass. Cavet's own people had said yes. That was the part he carried around inside him like a swallowed stone. The Sathari orchard habitats had tithed, knelt, sung the responses the lectors taught them, and the procession had passed through Sathari space without burning anything except the one moon that hesitated. His grandmother's moon, Veshet, whose orchards had been 400 years old. His grandmother had watched it burn from the evacuation barge. She had taught Cavet the kindled hymns herself, all 9 of them, note by note, and when his mother protested teaching a child the enemy's prayers, the old woman had said the sentence that eventually put Cavet Rin in a loader's cage, 1,200 light-years from home. Learn what the fire sings, so you will know exactly what it is promising you when it comes. The hollow reaches had said no, 40 inhabited worlds worth of no. And the no had to be made real somewhere, and the somewhere was the cross, because the procession's sacred order could not pass the dead stars without funneling through the same shallows everyone else used, and because if it crossed uncontested, it would reach the evacuation convoys in open space, and the fire would have 2.3 million sets of hands to warm itself on. The relief was coming. Everyone aboard said so, and the plot agreed. Terra's first-line fleet, 81 warships including 4 of Culverin's sisters, burning hard from the core anchorages. 26 days out the morning Cavet reported aboard. The procession was 11 days out. A junior rating did that subtraction in the mess on Cavet's second day, out loud, and the compartment went quiet, and an old petty officer from Turret 7 finished her coffee and said, "Yeah, so the door stays shut for 15 days. That's us. Anybody's soup getting cold over it, eat faster." It was the most frightening thing Kvet had ever heard, and the humans went on, eating around him, as though she had read them a duty roster, and that was his first true sight of the thing his grandmother's hymns had never mentioned. There was something in the galaxy that did not flinch at the procession, and he was inside it, and it smelled like soup and gun grease. He wrote one letter home that night. He did not say where he was. The censors would have cut it anyway. But that was not why. He did not say where he was because he could not find a way to write the sentence, "My ship is the door," that did not read as either a lie or a goodbye. Then there was no more time for letters because on his fourth day aboard, the procession's vanguard arrived early, and Kvet Rin fed a gun in anger for the first time in his life. The alarm caught him asleep. He learned later that it caught nearly everyone asleep. That was the point of it. The Kindled timed their first touch to the Defender's watch rotation, because the Lectors had been listening to Culverin's routine traffic for days, and the procession's whole art was the patient study of what it intended to burn. 9 votive rams and a lectorship had detached from the main body and come down the northern lane at flank acceleration, straight at the cross, straight at the head of a refugee convoy that was at that moment threading the shallows. 112 civilian hulls, strung out and helpless, with nothing between them and the rams but traffic control buoys and one old monitor. Kvet went up the ladder into Mule in his sleeping fur, with his boots in his hand, and the turret was already turning. What he remembered afterward was not fear, although the fear was there, an animal flattening of every membrane on his body as the hoist gate banged open and the first war shell in his life came up the trunk gleaming and live. What he remembered was that nobody in the turret raised their voice. "Stand by, Mule." Halloran in the gun captain's chair, reading his board, his scarred face lit green from below. "Vanguard Rams, 9, deployed echelon. They're going for the convoy, not us. Captain intends to disabuse them." Loader, the word was a hand on Kvet's shoulder. "Chief, just like the drill. The shell doesn't know the difference. Nobody in this can ever has died doing it right." A pause, the creak of his chair, and then, with no change of tone, "Stations confirm. Gun is hot. Load. Seat the shell. Check the seat. Clear the tray. Tray clear." And his voice cracked on it, and Decker's ram slid past the line where his hands had been a half-second before, and the breech screw turned with a sound like a vault. And somewhere over his head I've said match, soft as a card player, and the world ended. Nothing in the manuals had told him what a 27-rail monitor sounded like from inside one of her turrets. It was not a sound. It was a change in the laws of the compartment. The deck kicked, the air itself rang, every loose molecule in his body tried to swap places with its neighbor, and through the soles of his bare feet, his boots were still in the corner. Kvet felt the gun lunge against its recoil paths like a living thing, throwing its weight. 840 kilograms of tungsten left the center rail at 400 kilometers per second, crossed 19,000 kilometers of black, and removed the bow third of a votive ram that had been blessed, consecrated, and certified invincible by a church older than human spaceflight. "Hit," I've said. "Reload." The hoist gate banged. The next shell came up gleaming. Kvet Rin, who had been a fruit station tally clerk 14 months ago, took it in his arms. The action lasted 11 minutes. Mule fired 7 times, and the gun deck's other 8 turrets together fired 61, and what they did to 9 cathedral rams in the gravity shallows was not a battle but a sentence being carried out. The rams could not maneuver in. The shallows and Culverin's gunnery had been mapping those shallows for a decade. Every firing solution had been rehearsed against survey buoys 1,000 times, and the rams came on in their sacred echelon without dodging, because dodging was apostasy, and the gun line's arithmetic did the rest. The lectorship stood off at the edge of the engagement envelope and sang. Kvet heard it for only a moment when a comm panel on the gun deck spilled the intercept before a petty officer killed the channel. A vast, layered, beautiful chorus, 10,000 voices in disciplined harmony, singing range and bearing data to the rams as psalm verses. His membranes knew the melody before his mind did. Hymn 6, The Gathering of Fuel. His grandmother's voice, cracked and old, 60 years of distance in it. "That one means they have decided you are not people." The last ram broke apart at 6,000 kilometers, close enough that its death flare lit the gun deck amber through the void door slits. The convoy, 112 hulls, 11,000 civilians, passed through the cross behind Culverin's shoulder without losing a ship, and most of them never knew the rams had existed at all. In the turret there was no cheering. That was the thing that undid Kvet a little. In the ringing quiet after stand down, he had been raised on broadcast dramas where gunners whooped, and instead Ives put her forehead briefly against her console, and Decker flexed his hands open and shut, and the trainer, a narrow, quiet man named Birch, said 7 for 7, Chief, in the tone of a man reporting weather. 7 for 7, Halloran agreed. He unstrapped, stood, and on his way to the hatch, he stopped at the loader's cage and looked down at Cavett, barefoot, fur matted with sweat, arms trembling, alive. You called the tray late on round 4, the chief said. Cost us a second and a half. Decker Rams on the call, not on the look. A second and a half is a civilian hull some night when it matters. Yes, Chief. Halloran nodded once, slowly, that hull plate face unreadable. Then he said, Sumi called it late his first action too, and went down the ladder, and behind Cavett very quietly, Ives laughed, a small cracked sound but real, and Cavett stood in his cage with his heart slamming in both its chambers and understood that he had just been paid the first installment of something he did not yet have a name for. He found his boots. He went below. The procession was 10 days out, all 1,109 remaining hulls of it, and it did not grieve its rams, and it did not slow down. And somewhere at the heart of it, a living saint marked the velvet cross on a litany of things to be burned. The door stayed shut. 15 days. Eat faster. Within a week, Cavett Rin could load Mule's center rail in his sleep, and twice did, jerking awake in his rack with his arms cradling a shell that was not there, to the sound of Decker in the next rack, saying without opening his eyes, Tray clear. Go back to sleep, loader. Within a week, he also learned the shape of the ship the way a small animal learns a great tree, because Culverin's doctrine had a rule that astonished him more than the guns had. Every hand learns every station. The humans called it cross-rating, and they enforced it like a religion of their own. A loader stood rangefinder watches. A cook could patch a power bus. The Navy that built the gun line had decided, in some bled-for century, that a warship was not a machine crewed by specialists but a single organism that refused to die piecemeal, and so on his 9th day aboard, with the procession 6 days out and the evacuation convoys running through the cross, around the clock, Cavett Rin was rotated out of his cage and sent up 11 decks to fire control to learn the second station of his life. And the campaign for the Velvet Cross began in earnest while he was learning it. Fire control aboard Culverin lived in a long, low compartment the crew called the loft, and the loft belonged to Chief Fire Controlman Adaziobi, whom the entire ship, including the captain, called Numbers. She was the oldest human Cavett had yet seen up close, her hair a tight gray cap, her hands spotted, her voice a dry instrument that never rose, and she ran 12 console operators and the brains of 27 railguns the way his grandmother had run an orchard. Nothing hurried, nothing wasted, everything seen. On Cavett's first watch, she sat him at the dead reckoning plot, handed him a stylus, and said, Loader, tell me what a gun is. A gun is? He had learned enough about humans to suspect the obvious answer was a trap, a weapon that throws a shell. That's what a gun does. I asked what it is. She tapped the plot, where the cross hung rendered in soft amber lines, the 4 great lanes braiding into the shallows. A gun is a promise about the future. When Mule fires, the shell arrives somewhere half a minute later. We are not shooting at where the enemy is. We are shooting at where the enemy must be, 30 seconds from now. Fire control is the art of knowing what the future is required to look like. Up here, we don't throw shells, Loader, we throw prophecy. The Kindled think that's their department. Something moved at the corner of her dry mouth that was not quite a smile. We are going to spend the next 2 weeks teaching them about competition. The procession came on. It did not send its vanguard again, not at first. It sent its voice. The lectorships moved up to the edge of the deep water beyond the shallows, 11 of them now, deployed in a wide crescent across the northern and western approaches, outside the reach of even Culverin's rails, and they began to sing into every channel the cross used. Traffic control frequencies, distress bands, the civilian convoys coordination nets. The hymns came layered and patient, beautiful in a way Cavett hated himself for hearing, and tucked inside the harmonies like wire inside a braid came the Kindled's true work. Machine code psalms that hunted for automated systems and taught them to pray. A traffic buoy at the mouth of the western lane was the first convert. It began retransmitting him too with its collision warning laser, and a grain hauler trusted its navigation handshake and was 11 seconds from the Dead Star's tidal sheer before a human quartermaster aboard Culverin, running the lane watch by eye and instinct because the gun line assumed every machine was a potential apostate, screamed an abort order across an open channel, and turned 106 lives back onto the safe line with his voice alone. After that, Captain Elias Ward ordered the buoy shot. It fell to Mule's sister turret to do it, and the gun deck took no joy in it. Cavett watched from the loft as Culverin's own gunnery methodically destroyed 40 years of carefully maintained navigation infrastructure, 22 buoys, each one a perfect single-shell kill, because the alternative was leaving the enemy a choir of traitor lighthouses. From that hour, the Velvet Cross had no automated guidance at all. Every convoy that ran the shallows ran on human con officers reading gravity by feel with culverin signal lamps. Actual lamps, actual light, a code older than Terran spaceflight, walking them through lane by lane. The lectors adjusted. The hymns turned from machines to minds. They learned the crew's names. That was the part the briefings had not prepared anyone for, though Cavett, who had been raised by a survivor, had tried to warn his messmates. The procession had been listening to the cross's traffic for weeks, and to the broader reaches for years, and somewhere in the font of embers a patient clerical engine had been assembling souls the way numbers assembled firing solutions. On the 11th night the distress band opened, and a voice that was not a chorus but a single warm, reasonable speaker said, "Adays Obi. Your mother's grave is on Calloway's World, which is fuel. Roan Halloran. Your brother sails a tug at Hadrian's Gate, which is fuel. Elias Ward, Shepherd of the Door. Every name aboard your vessel is written already in the ledger of fuel, but the ledger has margins, and mercy lives in the margins. Open the door, and your names will be moved." It went on for 4 hours, name after name, rating after rating. It knew birthdays. It knew the name of Ives's daughter on Meridian Station and recited it gently 3 times. Cavett sat his watch in the loft, with his membranes clamped flat, and waited for the humans to break, because the voice was very good, and the voice hadn't broken worlds. Numbers Obi listened to her mother's grave being priced, finished annotating a range table, and keyed the loft's intercom to the gun deck. All turrets fire control. The enemy has confirmed their acoustic library is 20 months stale. They think Vasquez is still aboard, and they've got Turret 5's roster wrong. Log it. That's a collection gap, and collection gaps are range data. A pause dry as dust. Also, somebody tell Ives her kid made the enemy's strategic ledger before age 6. Family's first medal. The gun deck's answering laughter rolled up 11 decks through the trunk spaces, and Cavett heard it with his whole body, and something in him shifted then and never shifted back. The kindled's voice was beautiful and vast, and it had glassed 6 worlds, and the humans had just turned it into a clerical error and a joke about a little girl. Not because they did not feel the threat, he realized, watching Ives's jaw work as she laughed anyway, but because laughing at it together was a weapon, drilled and maintained like the rails, and every hand aboard knew how to load it. His own name was in the 4th hour. Cavett Rin, son of the orchards, grandson of Veshit that hesitated. Your people knelt wisely once. Kneel again, little brother. The fire remembers its friends. The loft went still around him. 12 human faces turned, not unkindly, to see what the levy loader would do with that. Cavett thought of his grandmother's hands over her ears. He keyed his own console, the way numbers had, and said to the gun deck, "Fire control, loader's correction." The orchards of Veshit were 400 years old, and it burned them anyway, friendship and all. Enemy testimony is unreliable. Recommend we proceed on the arithmetic. Silence for 1 heartbeat. Then Halloran's voice came up the net from inside Mule, flat as ever. Gun deck concurs with the loader, and someone down there started the laugh again. And that night in the mess, a petty officer from Turret 1 whom Cavett had never met put a mug of the human's terrible coffee in front of him without a word, and Decker explained later, between rack inspections. "That's it, you know. That's the whole ceremony. There isn't a fancier one." The mining of the lanes began on the 13th day, and it was the loft's battle, and Cavett fought it at the dead reckoning plot with a stylus and a stopwatch. The procession would not commit its sacred order to the shallows piecemeal. Its liturgy forbade entering the strait until the whole formation could process through together, but it could seed the water ahead of itself, and it did. Tithe barges by 2s and 3s, racing down the northern and western lanes at irreligious accelerations, scattering ember mines into the braided gravity like a sower flinging seed. The mines were small, cold, blessed, and nearly impossible to see until they lit, and what they lit was a refugee lane. Culverin could not leave the crossing point to chase barges. The door does not chase. So the engagement became a 14-hour problem in prophecy. The barges' release points and the shallows' currents decided where the mines would drift. The mines' drift decided where they had to be swept, and the only sweeping tool that could not be hemmed into apostasy was a rail shell's kinetic wake. Numbers Obi stood at the master plot with 40 years of the cross's gravity in her head, and read the currents and called the future. This seeding, released there at that vector, crosses lane 2's safe line in 9 hours. Put a shell into this empty cube of black at 0341, and the wakefront shepherds the whole drift into the tidal shear, where the dead stars eat it. Empty cubes of black. That was what Culverin's gunnery spent the day killing, nothing, hour after hour, shell after shell placed into vacant space with surgical fury, and the mines slid harmlessly into the shear by the 100, and the convoys ran on through a battlefield they could not see, shepherded by detonations they were never told about. In the middle of it, Cavett found the pattern. He was tracking barge release points with his stylus, cross-timing them against the intercepted hymn traffic because his were the only membranes aboard that could hold the whole 9-hymn cycle in memory, and at hour 9 he saw it. The releases fell on the hymn. Every seeding came on the downbeat of the third verse of whichever psalm the lectors were singing. The procession's coordination was its liturgy, the liturgy was its clock, and the clock was audible. He checked it across 6 releases, hearts hammering, then stood up at the plot and said, louder than he had ever said anything aboard, "Chief, the next barge has come at the third verse, 2 minutes 10. Number Zobi looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then she rotated the master plot, laid 3 turrets onto the predicted release window and emptied deep water at the absolute limit of the rail's reach, and said, "Stand by, gun deck." The loader hears their wristwatch. The barges arrived on the downbeat, into a sky of tungsten that had been fired before they existed there. After the second barge pair died that way, the procession stopped seeding the lanes. The loft logged it primly as enemy mining operations discontinued because cost. The gun deck said it differently. By supper, the whole ship was saying that Mule's new loader had shot down a church with a stopwatch, which was not what had happened, and Cavett protested as much, and it changed nothing, because he was learning that a crew decides what its stories are and then feeds them exactly like guns. I've sat across from him at supper that night. First time, she didn't mention the barges. She said Sumi used to sing in the cage. Old Java Sea Song's terrible voice drove the chief insane. She turned her mug around twice. You hum sometimes. On the long reloads, you probably don't know you do it. I can stop. Don't, she said, and took her tray and left, and Decker, who missed nothing while appearing to perceive nothing, said, "Told you, ceremony's done. Your cargo now." "Cargo? Things the ship carries," Decker said. "It can lose." He racked his tray and looked down at Cavett from his improbable height, and for once finished the thought. "Crew, it can't. Congratulations. It's worse." On the 15th day, the procession of the last ember arrived at the mouth of the Velic Cross in full sacred order, 1,109 hulls deploying across the northern and western deep water like a stained glass window assembling itself, and stopped. It was not supposed to stop. 206 years and the procession had never stopped. Culverin's intelligence officers offered the obvious reading. The strait was narrow, the door was armed, the relief fleet was coming, and even fanatics could count. Captain Ward, who had spent the approach reading translated kindled liturgy the way numbers read currents, offered a worse one at the wardroom briefing, and it leaked down the trunk spaces inside a watch, because everything aboard a warship leaks downward. The procession had not stopped to reconsider. The procession had stopped to consecrate. Their creed did not permit them to be delayed by the profane. So when something did delay them, doctrine required that the obstacle be reclassified. Delay was an insult. A door that stayed shut was a heresy. And heresy could not simply be bypassed or bombarded at convenience. Heresy had to be processed, formally by the whole congregation, with the Ember Keeper presiding. In the kindled's 2 centuries of fire, that reclassification had been performed against worlds 6 times. It had never once been performed against a single ship. "They've promoted us," Ward told the ship's company over the main circuit that evening, in the dry conversational voice the crew imitated for years afterward, those who had years. As of this afternoon's enemy hymn traffic, this vessel is no longer an obstacle on the route schedule. We are now, I'm told, the door that refuses, and the procession is preparing the full right for our personal benefit. I've consulted the gunnery department. A pause, the precise length of a breath. We find we are unable to care, and the watch routine is unchanged. Carry on. Cavett stood his watch. Around him, impossibly, the humans carried on, and beneath their calm he could now read the other thing, the thing his first week aboard had hidden from him. They knew. Every one of them knew the arithmetic of one ship against 1,100, knew the relief was still 11 days out, knew what the consecration of the right meant. The calm was not ignorance and was not bravado. It was a decision made individually and continuously, renewed every watch like a lamp being trimmed, and made easier, he saw, by one strange mercy. Not one of them had to make it alone. That night the entire procession lit its hulls. 1,100 ships kindled votive fires along their spines until the northern deep water burned like a constellation that had come too close, and across every channel at once, in a chorus of 10,000 voices, the kindled began the rite of the closed door, and the siege of the Velic Cross entered its final shape. The first verse of the rite was fire, and it fell on the 17th day, and it fell on the helm. Cavett was on the bridge when it began, and he was on the bridge because of the cross-rating doctrine and a watch bill drawn up 2 days earlier in Halloran's blunt pencil, Rincon Messenger, Fuddy Bridge, Watches 2 and 4. When he had protested that a loader had no business among officers, the chief had looked at him with something that was almost amusement and said, "Loader, in 11 days every station on this ship is going to be somebody's business who never expected it." The captain agrees. Go learn what the ship feels like from her spine. The forward bridge of Culverin was quieter than the loft and far quieter than the turret. A red-lit vault where a dozen watchstanders spoke in low voices, and the great curved viewports were shuttered down to slits behind meters of armor. At its center, raised, sat the Khan, the officer of the deck, the quartermaster of the watch, and the helm itself, which was not a wheel or a yoke, but a wide console where a senior helmsman, named Petty Officer Vasquez Show, kept 4,000 meters of warship. Balanced against the braided gravity of two dead stars, the way a stevedore balances a load, constantly, unconsciously, with his whole body. The Cross's shallows, Cavett learned at that console, were not a place a ship parked. They were a place a ship swam. The dead pair's interlocked tides pulled at every hull in the strait from two directions at once, and the safe waters shifted with their orbit, hour by hour, in patterns that Culverin's quartermasters had spent a decade learning to read off instruments, and when the instruments lied, off the seat of their trousers. This was the door's deepest secret and its true armor, and Vasquez Show explained it to the alien messenger in the lull of a mid-watch with unconcealed professional love. Anyone can hold the crossing point on a chart, see Park on the X. But the X moves, the tides slosh. The safe channel walks east maybe 900 kilometers over a watch, then walks back. We move with it. Procession wants to shoot us. They've got to solve us and the tide. Their fire arrives where we were. And when they enter the strait, they have to enter. The right says walk through the door, not around. Their sacred order hits moving water their liturgy hasn't blessed. Formation like theirs in the shallows? He shook his head slowly. It's not a window anymore, mate. It's stained glass in a flood. And us? We are also one ship in the same flood. Yeah, but we're not a window. Vasquez Show tapped the console with 2 fingers, a small, fond gesture. We're the thing the flood's been living with for 10 years. Old Cully here drinks this water. At 0214 on the 17th day, the procession's first ranging hymn arrived and the water itself caught fire. The kindled could not enter the strait until the rite's verses were sung in order, but the first verse, the verse of ash, the rite's formal demand that the heresy unmake itself, came as a bombardment thrown from the deep water. Pyre carriers in their hundreds volleying consecrated munitions down the northern lane in great slow flocks, not aimed shots but a weather of fire, area saturation laid across every cubic kilometer the defenders might occupy. The bridge slits showed it as a dawn that kept rising, wave after wave of amber points blooming out of the dark, 11 minutes from launch to arrival, beautiful the way everything of theirs was beautiful, and lethal across a footprint 40 times the size of the safe channel. And so began the duel that the survivors of the Velvet Cross would the rest of their lives failing to describe to anyone who had not stood it. 11 days of the tide. The procession threw its weather of fire on the downbeat, hymn by hymn. Numbers Obi's plotters in the loft read each volley spread in the first 90 seconds of its 11-minute fall and called the footprint. The quartermasters read the tide, and Vasquez Show and his reliefs took 4,000 meters of monitor and swam her, watch after watch, through the one channel of black water where this volley was not going to be, while the gun deck, never pausing, threw prophecy back along the enemy's own ballistic arithmetic and made the pyre carriers pay a hull for every third volley. Fire fell where Culverin had been. Tungsten arrived where the carriers were required to be. The exchange rate was a sermon of its own, and the procession refused to read it, because 206 years of liturgy had not prepared the kindled for a door that moved. Cavett ran the Khan messenger watches through all of it, and what he carried up and down the spine of the ship during those days was mostly paper. The gun line trusted paper the way it trusted loaders, for the same reasons, but what he carried away from the bridge, permanently, was the sound of the humans' voices not changing. Footprint called, channel called, helm answering, fall of shot, 11 minutes mark. The deck shuddering as the rails answered. 100 decisions an hour, every one of them mortal, delivered in the cadence of beings discussing the unloading of freight, and under it all Vasquez Show's hands on the console, easy as breathing, swimming the door through the fire. On the 19th day, the fire found them anyway. It was not an error. Everyone from the captain down had said it plainly. Saturation weather cannot be dodged forever. The arithmetic only promises most volleys, not all. The volley that caught them was thrown wide on a deliberate spread, the kindled spending 60 shots to fence one exit, and the tide chose that hour to walk the safe channel directly under it, and Vasquez Show threaded the gap that existed, and the gap was 400 meters narrower than the ship was lucky. 3 consecrated munitions struck Culverin's port quarter, forward of the engine spaces, on frames 80 through 84. From the bridge, 11 decks and 2 kilometers away, it was a triple shutter and a course correction and a board going amber. In frames 80 through 84, it was the end of the world. Compartments opened to the black. A magazine hoist trunk scorched its whole height, and the after dressing station, the compartment where Doc Ferreira's mates triaged the gun deck's burns and crush injuries, ceased to exist with 9 of the ship's company inside it. Cavett learned their names off the casualty board the way the rest of the crew did, standing in the passageway outside the mess in a silence he now understood from the inside. 9 names, the first of the campaign. One of them was Vasquez's cousin, a storekeeper third class who had been carrying battle dressings aft. He looked for the helmsman that night and found him in the petty officer's mess with his palms flat on the table and his eyes closed. And Cavett, who did not know what his own people's grief customs could offer a human and suspected the answer was nothing, simply stood there until Vasquez said without opening his eyes, "You hum, right? The gun deck says you hum." "Aye, yes, apparently hum something from home. Not theirs, yours." So Cavett Rin stood in a Terran warship's mess under 2 dead stars and hummed the Sathari threshing song his grandmother had used for counting. Cadence, the one for the year's last harvest, and the helmsman listened all the way through twice, eyes shut, hands flat, and at the end he opened his eyes and said, "Okay," and stood and went back up the ladder toward the bridge. And at 0214 he was at his console again, swimming the door through the verse of ash with his cousin's name fresh on the breech ring of a turret that storekeepers don't even serve. Because the gun deck had voted sometime that night that anyone who dies carrying dressings toward the guns has fed the guns, and Halloran himself had cut the letters. That was the helm's act of the siege, and it held for 11 days, and the arithmetic of it was carved into the official record afterward in numbers. Even the core world news feeds could not make boring. 940 consecrated munitions thrown, 11 hits sustained, 31 pyre carriers and 4 lector ships destroyed by counter-battery fire arriving along their own hymns. The convoys never stopped running. In 11 days of fire weather, with the strait lit like a forge from one end to the other, 4,100 civilian hulls crossed the Velik shallows behind the moving wall of one ship, and the count of refugee lives lost to enemy action in transit, audited 3 times by 3 separate commissions after the war, was published, rechecked and confirmed, 0. Cavett saw the number years later printed, and what he remembered was not pride. What he remembered was the smell of scorched insulation in frame 82, and 9 names in a passageway, and a man with his palms flat on a table asking an alien to hum, because the door held. The door was never, for one watch of those 11 days, in danger of breaking from the fire alone. The procession's weather could wound Culverin, but could not solve her. And the Kindled's own ballistic clerks must have run that conclusion up, whatever passed for their chain of grace, because on the 28th day the bombardment stopped between one hymn and the next, and the silence rang harder than the fire had. The relief fleet was 3 days out. 81 warships of the first line, decelerating hard, close enough now that their drive flares showed on the loft's long instruments like a row of faint blue dawn. The procession could count. Everyone had said so. And the procession had spent 11 days learning what every fleet that ever faced the gun line learned, that the arithmetic was unkind, and now its window was 3 days wide and closing, and a sane enemy would have turned away. The Kindled were not a sane enemy. They were a faithful one, and the right had 2 verses left. At 0300 on the 28th day, the lector ships began hymn 9. Cavett was in his rack when the intercept watch piped the alert, and he was the only being aboard who came up off his mattress before the translation. Circuits had parsed a single phrase, because he was the only being aboard whose grandmother had sung him hymn 9 as a warning instead of a lullaby. The hymn that had no third verse, because its third verse was the act itself. The hymn of the last procession. The one that means they have stopped trying to make you fuel. The one that means they have decided to spend themselves. He was dressed and moving before the general alarm sounded, and as he swung onto the gun deck ladder he heard, rising through the trunk spaces from 1,100 hulls in the deep water, 10,000 voices in disciplined harmony begin the verse that consecrated every ship in the procession of the last ember as a single burning offering, and the whole stained glass constellation of them, votive fires blazing, weighed anchor at once and turned its face to the strait. They were coming through the door, all of them, together. General quarters, all hands man your battle stations. This is not a drill. The procession is in the water. 1,100 ships do not enter a strait 11,000 kilometers wide. They pour into it, and the strait fills the way a canyon fills in a flood year, and the flood was singing. Cavett's battle station for the first watch of the last battle was not the loader's cage. The watch bill had rotated again, Halloran's blunt pencil, the captain's signature, and the bill said Rin K, damage control party 6. Frames 70-90, and so Cavett Rin spent the opening hours of the Battle of the Velik Cross 11 decks below his gun, in a breathing rig size for a human and strapped twice to fit him, in the scorched passageways aft of frame 80, waiting with 9 humans and a Vethian levy machinist named Soloran for the ship to be wounded somewhere within their reach. Party 6's leader was a senior chief hull technician named Okonkwo, a compact, deliberate woman who had been patching warships since before Kvet was born, and while the deck shuddered with the rail's long rolling thunder and the plot repeaters painted the strait filling with fire, she delivered the only battle speech Kvet ever heard aboard Culverin. Nobody fights the enemy in this party. We fight the ship's problems. Fire, water, air, structure, in that order unless I say different. You move when I say, you breathe slow, and you do not look at the plot. The plot is the captain's problem. The bulkhead in front of you is yours. She checked the seal on Kvet's borrowed rig herself, cinched it, slapped it once. Levy, you did good work with a stopwatch. Patching's the same religion. The ship tells you the truth or you die. Stay on my shoulder. The procession came down the strait in its sacred order, and the sacred order met the tide. And the first thing the Battle of the Velic Cross proved was Vasquez Show's flood and stained glass arithmetic at scale in front of witnesses. The Kindled had solved nothing about the shallows. Their liturgy did not permit the formation to break, and the braided gravity did not care what the liturgy permitted. And so the great window of 1,100 hulls hit the moving water and began, majestically, catastrophically, to shear. Votive rams in the vanguard slid out of their stations into the tidal margins and were taken by the dead stars, not destroyed but seized, dragged off the safe water into sheer gradients that folded consecrated hulls like prayer paper, 11 of them in the first hour, without Culverin firing a shot at any of them. The formation's wings, forbidden to flatten, crowded toward the one safe channel, and the one safe channel was a corridor whose every meter numbers Obi's plotters had pre-registered across 10 years, and down at the crossing point, swimming in water she had drunk for a decade, the door began the work for which the gun line had been built. 27 rails, firing in disciplined rotation, into a target the size of a weather system that could not dodge, could not scatter, and would not turn. The loft did not even compute solutions in the ordinary sense. It ran down a pre-registered fire plan like a bell ringer running changes, and the head of the procession's column entered the meat grinder of the pre-sighted channel, and was unmade there, hull by hull by hull, with a regularity that Kvet, watching the repeater he was not supposed to watch, between calls, found more terrible than any fury could have been. Every 90 seconds, Mule spoke somewhere above him, and every time Mule spoke, somewhere in the strait a cathedral died. The procession's answer was the right second verse, and the second verse was the verse of hands. And it was the reason the watch bill had 9 humans and 2 aliens waiting in a passageway at frame 80. The martyr barges came down the strait inside the wreck stream of their own dead, small, cold-running, ember-shielded craft drifting amid the tumbling hulks where even the gun line's gunnery could not sieve every contact, and they did not try to kill Culverin because killing the door was the pyre carrier's failed verse. The barges came to touch it, to lay hands on the heresy. 41 of them, launched from the Font of Embers itself, each one carrying 60 of the Kindled's consecrated borders. Beings bred and blessed for exactly this, sheathed in ablative shrouds, singing as they came. 33 barges died in the close defense gun's interlocking fire, at ranges the gun deck called conversational. 8 reached the hull. The sound of a martyr barge mating to a warship's skin, Kvet learned at 051 on the 29th day, is a bell. A single vast soft note carried through the structure of the ship into the bones of everyone aboard, followed by the bright tearing shriek of cutting flame. And then this was the part no briefing had conveyed. The singing, coming through the hull plating itself, conducted by the metal, 60 voices in harmony arriving through the soles of your boots. 2 of the 8 barges struck within Party 6's frames. That's us, Okonkwo said, as the bell note died. Fire, water, air, structure. And today, exterminators. Move. What followed lived in Kvet's body for the rest of his life, in the way of things that happened too fast and too close for memory to file properly. 40 minutes in the smoke-filled passageways between frames 74 and 88, in a rolling running fight that was nothing like the clean, terrible geometry of the gun deck's war, and everything like the oldest nightmares of every species that ever climbed out of a burrow. The kindled boarders came through their breach behind, cutting flame in their pale shrouds, singing, and the ship's defense parties met them at the junctions with shotguns and breaching tools in the absolute, unhurried, door-by-door method of beings defending their home down corridors they had walked 10,000 times in the dark. Kvet did not fight the boarders. Party 6 fought the ship's problems, exactly as promised, and the problems were everywhere and biblical. The boarders cut hydraulic trunks to blind the turret's training gear, and Party 6 rerouted them. They fired the wiring spaces, and Party 6 smothered the fires. They blew the atmosphere out of compartment after compartment to kill the defenders' mobility, and Party 6 moved through the airless dark in their rigs, dogging hatches, restoring pressure, patching the wounds as fast as the enemy's hands could make them, and twice, at junctions whose numbers Cavet never afterward remembered, the war found them anyway, pale shrouds and singing in the smoke, and both times the humans of Party 6 put themselves between the levy ratings and the enemy without any order being given, as though it were a step in a procedure written somewhere, and both times the Marines' reaction squads arrived down the trunk ladders like falling anvils and the singing stopped. In the middle of it, kneeling in a flooded cableway, his four-fingered, double-thumbed hands doing the one thing aboard they did better than any humans, holding a patch seated in a conduit too narrow for Terran wrists while a Conquo's torch sealed it. Cavet heard the 1MC crackle, and Captain Ward's voice came down through the smoke and the gunfire and the hymns, conversational as ever, addressing the boarders directly on the ship's own internal circuit, which the kindled had cut into and which Ward had declined to close because he wanted them to hear it. Attention, guests of the door that refuses. You are the 8th through 15th boarding actions this vessel has recorded in her 41 years. The previous 14 are commemorated in the wardroom on a small and not very impressive plaque. There is room remaining on the plaque. The cross is shut. Culverin, carry on. And around Cavet, in the smoke, the filthy, exhausted humans of Party 6 grinned inside their masks and went back to work. And through the hull, plating the singing of the boarders faltered, just slightly, for the first time, because the Lecter's clerical engines had built their model of humanity from worlds that begged and worlds that broke, and nothing in 206 years of the ledger of fuel had prepared the faithful for a species that answered the verse of hands with a remark about a plaque. The last boarder died at 0658 at the junction of frame 82 and the portside magazine trunk, the deepest any of the kindled, got one compartment's bulkhead from the hoist rooms that fed turret 3, and the being who stopped the breaching charge from going on to that bulkhead was gunner's mate First Class Mira Ives. She was not supposed to be there. Mule's gunner belonged in the turret, and the turret had fought all night with its training gear blinded and re-sighted twice by Party 6's patches. But when the boarders' last squad cut toward the magazines, the gun deck's defense detail was 2 junctions out of position, and the only thing between the pale shrouds and the hoist rooms was a repair locker where Ives had come down on the chief's order to walk a replacement elevation servo up to the turret by hand. The recordings reconstructed it afterward. 4 boarders, 1 breaching charge, 1 human with a servo crate and a sidearm 14 seconds. She killed 2 of them, jammed the charge's cradle with the thrown crate so it could not seat against the bulkhead, and was through her last second of life dragging the charge bodily away from the magazine wall when it detonated in the open passageway where the blast spent itself on empty air and structure instead of cracking into the hoist rooms, and the magazines did not light, and Turret 3's crews, 11 meters away through the bulkhead, fired on schedule 90 seconds later, not yet knowing what their gunner had bought them or what it had cost. Cavet was the one who found her. Party 6 reached the junction 90 seconds after the blast, fighting the fire it had started, and he came around the buckled frame on Okonkwo's shoulder and saw the sidearm first, and then the rest, and the universe divided cleanly into the time before he understood what he was looking at and all the time after. There was nothing for the corpsman to do. He knew that before he knelt. He knelt anyway in the foam and the smoke beside the small wire-built woman who had told him on his first day exactly what he was and was not entitled to, and who had been the first to make a place for him anyway. You don't get his place, you get a place, and his hands, which had not stopped working all night, stopped and would not start. Levy, Okonkwo's voice, very quiet, very close. Her hand on his shoulder, turning him with gentle force away. Fire, water, air, structure. I know who she is. The senior chief's face behind her mask was a worn carving. Her eyes had counted casualties for 30 years, and they were wet now and absolutely steady, and Cavet understood that he was being taught the last station of the rotation, the one that appeared on no watch bill. And the gun she kept alive is firing right now, and the fire I am looking at is 11 meters from its hoist trunk. Help me kill it, and then we'll carry her up ourselves, you and me. Both things happen, loader, in that order. That's the whole job. He helped her kill it, and then they carried her up, the alien and the old chief, through passageways where the crew stood aside and uncovered as they passed, while above them the rails rolled on without pause, every 90 seconds, all the way to the dressing station. And at the hatch, Okonkwo stopped him and said the sentence the whole ship had been building towards since the morning a stretcher with a flag on it had passed a Sathari recruit at the foot of a turret ladder. You can set her down now, son. She's home. The boarding verse failed. The official action report compressed 8 barges, 390 dead fanatics, 11 hours, and the worst night of Kvet Rin's life into 4 words. All breaches contained, combat effective, and the procession, watching its second verse die against the hull of one ship, paused in the wreck-choked water at the mouth of the strait and went silent for the first time in days, and aboard Culverin the silence was worse than the hymns because every plotter in the loft and every gunner on the deck and one grieving alien loader knew the same thing. The right had 1 verse left. The relief fleet was 40 hours out, and at the heart of the stalled stained glass flood, burning brighter than everything around it, the font of embers, 14 kilometers of reliquary fortress carrying the living saint of the kindled, had begun at last to move toward the door itself. Halloran came down to the dressing station himself, an hour after the boarding ended, and found Kvet sitting against the passageway bulkhead outside it with his breathing rig in his lap, and stood over him for a moment, and then, to the lasting astonishment of the corpsman's watch, lowered himself down the bulkhead to sit beside a loader third class on the deck, plates, his ruined knees cracking like gun gas. For a while he said nothing, which was a language Kvet had learned to read. 11 years, the chief said finally. I've sat second seat to me for 11 years. I taught her the chair. She'd have had mule when I went ashore, and she'd have been better at it than me, and she knew it. And she never once said it, because that would have hurt my feelings. His scarred face did not move. The words came out at the same flat pitch he used for elevation corrections. I cut Sumi's name in March. I'll cut hers tonight. You want to know the thing nobody tells you, loader? The thing about the brotherhood. Kvet's translator collar made a soft interrogative click. He could not manage actual words. Everybody thinks the price of it is dying, Halloran said. It isn't. Dying's the cheap seat. The price of it is this, sitting where you're sitting, doing what you're doing as many times as the gun asks you to, and getting up anyway. You pay it every time, and it never gets smaller, and you pay it anyway. That's the whole tuition, and there's no scholarship. And the ones who can't pay it leave the deck, and nobody blames them, and we don't get to leave because he consulted, without hurry, the watch on his thick wrist. 38 hours, the biggest thing the enemy owns is going to walk up to our door, and mule will want feeding. He stood, joints cracking again, and held out one enormous hand and hauled Kvet up off the deck, as though the Sathari weighed nothing at all. Watch bills changed, the chief said. Captain signed it 20 minutes ago. You're off damage control. 0800 tomorrow, you're in the turret. He paused, 1 beat, precisely as long as the pause before a salvo. Second seat. My right hand, where she sat. I'll teach you the chair as far as we get. Don't say anything stupid about not being worthy. I haven't got the watch hours left to argue, and anyway the gun already voted. It's been voting since the day you called their wristwatch. Get some sleep, loader. Tomorrow we finish this. The last day before the last battle, the door made its preparations, and the strait held its breath. And Kvet Rin learned the gun captain's chair. It was not like the cage, and not like the loft, and not like the helm. The cage had taught him the gun's hunger, the loft its prophecy, the helm its water. The chair was where all of it ran together into a single seat of judgment, and Halloran walked him through its world with a patience the chief had never once shown him at any other station. The local fire control loop for when the loft went silent. The manual train and elevate that 4 decades of gunners' mates had kept oiled against the day every circuit died. The dead man interlocks, the magazine discipline. The 9 separate ways a turret captain could keep his gun firing as the ship died around it, each one bled for somewhere, each one written in the blunt grease pencil scripture of the gun line, and woven through the mechanics in fragments and asides, the older curriculum, when you rest the crew and when you spend them, what you say in the can when the soot comes and what you never say, how you call a load count to a loader whose hands you cannot see so that your voice itself is a handrail in the dark. Why me? Kvet asked once in the afternoon because it had to be asked. You have humans with 20 years. Got humans with 30, Halloran agreed. Birch could take the chair tomorrow, and if I'm wrong about how this goes, he will. He was reassembling the interlock he had just made Kvet strip blind, those vast hands moving like watchmakers' tools. But the gun's been teaching you since the hour you came up that ladder barefoot, and you don't unlearn the way you learned, and there's a thing you've got that my 30-year men haven't. He seated the assembly, torqued it, checked it twice, the way he checked everything twice. You know what's coming for us, from inside. Your grandmother put it in you before you could walk. Tomorrow, when that thing sings its last verse at us, every soul on this deck is going to hear it for the first time and feel their blood try to leave. You've heard it your whole life. You're the only hand aboard who's already paid that toll, loader. The chair needs that more than it needs 20 years. At 1900, Captain Ward addressed the ship's company for the last time before the end, and his voice down the trunk spaces was the same dry instrument it had always been. and what he said entered the permanent legend of the gun line, every word of it logged and witnessed. Ship's company, this is the captain. The relief fleet arrives in 31 hours. The procession has decided not to wait for them, which is the first sound tactical judgment I've seen it make. Sometime after Euro 400, the font of embers will enter the strait with everything the enemy has left. Somewhere above 900 hulls, an attempt to walk over this ship, this crossing, and the 411 civilian hulls still in transit behind us. The arithmetic of that is not complicated, and I will not insult 41 years of gun deck by dressing it up. Here is what I will tell you instead. 11 days ago, the enemy renamed us. Their clerks meant it as a curse, and I find I cannot improve on it. Every ship of the line that holds this strait after us, and there will be ships of the line in this strait, holding it, for as long as there is a line, will inherit what the enemy's own liturgy is about to spend 900 hulls learning. That the door does not open because the knocking gets louder. All hands will be fed a hot meal at 2000. All hands will rest until 0300. The smoking lamp is lit until midnight, regulation notwithstanding, and I am reliably informed the gun deck has been holding a quantity of contraband coffee against a suitable occasion. Gentlemen, ladies, and our levy shipmates, this is the occasion. Captain out. The hot meal happened. The coffee happened. The genuine article, hoarded for 2 years, brewed in the hoist rooms and carried up to every station in the ship by the gun. Deck's youngest hands, and Cavett carried mule's share himself, cage to chair to rammer's well, and Decker drank his in silence and then said, looking at the breach where 2 names now shone with bright edges, Sumi, watch this, which was from Decker a eulogy, a prayer, and a promise of artillery complete. At 047 on the 31st day, since a green Sathari loader had reported aboard with his boots in his hand, the font of embers entered the Velic Strait, and the last verse began. It came on in the center of what remained of the procession, 912 hulls. The stained glass window reformed one final time around its reliquary heart, and it came singing, every voice of the kindled, raised together in the verse that had no successor, and the sound of it arrived ahead of the fleet through every channel and every hull plate, and Cavett Rin, strapped into the second seat with his membranes clamped, heard 10,000 voices sing the thing his grandmother had spent her life dreading, and found that the old woman had been right about all of it, and that Halloran had been right too. His blood tried to leave, and could not, because it had somewhere to be. He keyed the turret's local circuit and said, in the steadiest voice of his life, Mule, second seat. That's the last hymn they know. After this one, they've got nothing left to sing, stand to. And the door answered the verse with its own liturgy, rehearsed for 10 years and 11 days. The tide read, the channel called, the fire plan rolling, and Culverin swam out to meet 900 ships alone. The Battle of the Velic Cross, final phase, ran 4 hours and 11 minutes, and the survivors disagreed about everything in it except the shape. And the shape was this. The strait itself fought for the door, as it had all month, the sacred order shearing and crowding in the braided tides, the pre-registered channel grinding the procession's van to wreckage that fouled the water for the ranks behind. And the procession spent its hulls into the grinder with the perfect economy of total faith, using its own dead as ablative armor, walking its formation forward over the wrecks, meter by meter, hour by hour, paying 40 to 1 and paying it gladly, to bring the font of embers into the shallows where its mass and its fires could finally reach the crossing point. And the door, for the first time in the campaign, stood and took it, because the last 411 civilian hulls were in the water behind her, the evacuation's tail end, the old and the slow and the late, and the moving wall had to stay between the fire and them, and everyone aboard from the captain to the cooks had known for 11 days that the final verse would come down to this, the 1 hour when the door could not dodge. It was in that hour that the strait gave the campaign its cruelest arithmetic, and the door answered it with the act that the Reach's school children would one day recite before they could spell the ship's name. A refugee hull failed in the channel. She was called Long Meadow, an agricultural barge older than Culverin herself, the second to last ship of the entire evacuation, 1,100 souls from the smallest and poorest moons of the Reaches packed into holds built for seed grain, and at the worst possible minute of the worst possible hour, with the font's vanguard grinding into the shallows 11,000 kilometers north, her drive simply finished dying, and she fell out of the safe water toward the tidal margins with all the maneuvering authority of a thrown stone. Her distress call was not procedure. It was a woman's voice, cracking, saying the same thing 3 times. We have children aboard. We have children aboard. We have children aboard. Every plotter in the loft ran the same solution in the same 4 seconds, and the solution said, a tow was possible. And the only hull in the strait that could both reach her and survive the reaching was the one hull whose whole reason for existence required it to stand at the crossing point and not move. To save the barge, the door would have to step out of the doorway, 11 minutes off station, 11 minutes with the channel unwatched, and the fire walking forward. And every tactical text ever written said the same thing in the same dry print. You do not trade the door for a single hull. The arithmetic of the many forbids it. Captain Elias Ward let the staff finish reading him the arithmetic. The bridge recordings preserve 4 full seconds of silence, and then the order, dry as ever, already moving. The arithmetic of the many is what we're here defending, not what we're hiding behind. The day this ship lets 1,100 children fall into the sheer to improve her geometry, the door isn't worth holding. Helm, lay us alongside. Gun deck, you have 11 minutes to make the enemy regret the gap. Make it expensive. Cavett heard the order from the second seat, and what he remembered afterward was that no one in the turret said a word. Halloran simply leaned into his board and began assigning sectors as though the 11 minutes had been drilled for years, and in a sense they had. Everything aboard had been drilled for years. Courage on this ship was just procedure that had been paid for in advance. Culverin came off the crossing point, with her batteries rolling fire north into the Vanguard at maximum sustained rate, swam down through her own falling shot weather, took the dying barge alongside in moving water with 11 meters of clearance. The pilot school, texts still call the maneuver impossible and then print the helm log anyway. Vasquez chose hands flat and easy to the end, and passed her a tow line under fire while the verse of embers fell where the door had been standing, 90 seconds before. For 11 minutes, the most pre-registered killing channel in the galaxy stood open, and the procession's vanguard, given at last the one gift its liturgy had begged for, surged into the gap, and learned why the Loft had spent a decade mapping the shallows, because Numbers Obi had registered her fire plan not on where the door stood but on where the water led, and the channel was the channel, whether Culverin occupied it or not. The Vanguard came on into the grinder, and the grinder did not care that the miller had stepped away. Tungsten arrived along the old familiar arithmetic from a moving, towing, burning platform, and the lead votive rams died in the doorway they had been promised. 11 of them in 11 minutes, 1 per minute, a rate the gun deck noted with the grim satisfaction of tradesmen meeting a quota under unreasonable conditions. At minute 12, the door came back to the doorway with 1,100 souls in tow, transferred the line to the evacuation's escort tug at the southern mouth, and resumed her station as though resuming a sentence after a comma. Longmeadow lived. Her 1,100 lived, among them 61 children later photographed, world by world, growing up, growing old, a running feature the Reach's news feeds maintained for 70 years under the same recurring title, The Cargo of the 11 Minutes. And the woman whose cracking voice had said, "We have children aboard 3 times," became, in time, the parliamentarian who unveiled the slab of frame 82 under glass. And her speech at the unveiling was 11 words long. They stepped out of the doorway for us. Then they stepped back. Culverin was hit more times in those 4 hours than in the entire previous month. Cavett lived it from the second seat in fragments that never afterward assembled into sequence. The turret's world shrinking to soot and thunder, the hoist gates banging. Decker's ram, tireless mechanical, human, the new loader in the cage, a boy from the brushed steel corridors of Meridian. Station, 8 days aboard, Ives's name tape not yet removed from the rack he slept in, calling the tray clear in a voice that cracked exactly the way Cavett's had, while Cavett heard his own voice come back to the boy as a handrail in the dark, the load count flat and steady, and understood that the chair had already made its first transmission down the line. Frames forward of them took a hit that rang the whole barbette like the inside of a bell. The Loft went silent for 19 minutes, Numbers Obi's plotters fighting their own fires, and Mule fought on local control, Halloran reading the war through his board and his bones, second seat calling fall of shot off the optics, and the gun never missed its 90 seconds, not once. And somewhere in that 19 minutes, Cavett stopped being able to tell where his pulse ended, and the rail's rhythm began and never entirely regained the distinction. At 0716, a consecrated salvo from the Fon itself found Culverin's forward superstructure, and the blast wave that rolled aft through the trunk spaces reached into turret 3 through a sprung access plate and filled the can with white fire and shrapnel sleet, and the world came back to Cavett in ringing amber emergency light with the gun silent, and the chair beside him wet and wrong. Halloran was alive, that registered first, the huge hand still moving on the board, still trying to work the problem. Then the rest of it. The gun captain's face and eyes a mask of blood and burn, the board in front of him shattered, and the chief's voice, when it came, flat as ever and aimed with terrible precision at the second seat, "Report. Chief, your eyes. My eyes are the corpsman's problem and the corpsman's busy. Report," and the chair took him. That was the only way Cavett could ever describe it afterward. 30 days of the gun's teaching closed around him like a breach, and his voice went flat and level into the smoke entirely without his permission. The way Halloran's went, the way Ward's went, the way the door's voice always went when the soot came. Mule, second seat. Gun is dark, breech intact, hoist intact, crew, a beat. Counting shapes moving in the amber light, finding all of them moving. Crew effective. Local power to the rails is severed forward of the barbette. Train and elevation answering on manual. Chief, the run to the font's firing arc is 9 minutes. If we reroute the rail feed through the after trunk, we fire twice before she bears. Silence, 1/2 second. The precise length of the pause before a salvo. Then why, said Halloran, blind in his ruined chair, in exactly the voice he used for a late tray call. Are you still talking to me, gun captain? Feed the gun. They rerouted the feed. Decker's strength and the Meridian boy's small hands and the procedures 40 years of gunners' mates had kept oiled against exactly this day. And at ZO 729, with the font of embers filling the optics like a burning city stood on end, with its presiding saint singing the verse that had unmade 6 worlds, Turret 3 of the Terran line monitor Culverin came back from the dead, trained around by hand and spoke, and the loft, restored, spoke with it, and turrets 1 through 9, those that still answered, spoke together. And Captain Elias Ward did the thing that put him in the textbooks. He stopped dodging, turned the door's battered bow directly into the heart of the last hymn, and committed everything that remained of the gun line's arithmetic to a single sentence, flank speed, down the pre-registered channel, straight at the font of embers, firing the full broadside into the same bearing every 90 seconds, using the wrecks of the procession's own van as a bow wave of cover, trading hits for closure, until the range fell to what the gun deck called conversational, and the Dead Star's tide put the reliquary fortress, for 19 unforgivable seconds, beam on across the crossing point itself. For 19 seconds, the door that refuses and the font of embers looked at each other across 4,000 kilometers of burning water, point blank by the arithmetic of the line, and every rail Culverin still owned was loaded, and Cavet Rin's hand was on the firing key of Turret 3, and in his ears, through the open intercept channel, 10,000 voices reached the final phrase of the last verse there was. All batteries, said Captain Ward's voice, dry as dust, conversational to the end. The door is shut. Fire. Cavet fired, and 23 rails fired with him, and the broadside went into the font of embers along her whole consecrated length, into the shield shrines and the relic vaults and the choir decks and the engine temples, 11 seconds of tungsten arriving like the opinion of an entire species, and the living saint of the kindled, whose title Cavet's grandmother had only ever whispered with her hands over her ears, learned in the last moment of the rite what 6 glassed worlds had never been able to teach the faith. The fire goes out. The font of embers broke amidships, her votive flames guttering down her shattered length like a snuffed procession of candles, and the explosion of her relic magazines lit the straight white from end to end, and through the shadow of one battered Terran monitor 11,000 kilometers across the water of the Velic Cross, and through every channel on every band, the singing 206 years of it, unbroken, the clock and the creed and the terror of 40 worlds. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Cavet Rin ever heard, and into it, from 900 hulls bereft of their saint, their verse, and their clock, came nothing at all. The procession of the last ember, leaderless in moving water, it had never learned to swim. Its sacred order, shattered around the burning bones of its heart, simply ended. Some hulls drifted. Some fled up the lanes they had come down, scattering, formationless, profane. Some, their crews unable to imagine a universe in which the rite had failed, turned into the tidal sheer and let the dead stars take them. And Culverin's guns let them go, because the door's business was the crossing, and the crossing stood, and behind it, untouched. The last 411 hulls of the evacuation of the hollow reaches ran on through the shallows toward the living future, shepherded to the end by a moving wall that was at 0731 on the 31st day, still exactly where it had always been. The door held. The door had always held. And high in the soot-black can of Turret 3, a green Sathark replacement, who was neither green nor a replacement anymore, sat back in the second seat with his hand still on the key, and heard beside him in the dark the blind old master of the gun let out one long breath and say, "To the can, to the names on the breech ring, to 11 years of Ives and a march of Samarno," in a voice that was, for the first and only time in 30 days, not entirely flat. 7 for 7, gun captain, stand down. But the door did not stand down, because the door's business was the crossing, and the crossing was not yet handed over. And so the strangest watch of the entire campaign began. The vigil of the 31st day, when one mauled monitor kept the Velic Cross alone over the wreckage of the largest Crusade fleet assembled in 2 centuries, with her relief still 30 hours out and 411 civilian hulls still threading the shallows behind her shoulder. Cavett stood half of it in the chair because Halloran was in the casualty bays having his eyes argued over by Doc Ferreira's exhausted mates, and Birch, who could have taken the turret in a heartbeat exactly as the chief had said, instead planted himself at the trainer's station, announced, "Second seat has the gun, I have the watch I want," and would not be moved. Mule's can was a ruin of soot and emergency lighting and a sprung access plate patched with welded locker doors, and the gun answered every test of train and elevation like an old animal that had decided against the evidence that it was not done, and around the turret the rest of Culverin made the same decision compartment by compartment through the long count of hours. The ship had been struck, the final tally when the yard surveyors were done crawling her, 107 times in 31 days. 2 of her 9 turrets were burned out. She had 91 dead and over 300 wounded, her forward superstructure was a sculpture of slag, and she held her trim in the tides with a 4-degree list that the quartermasters corrected for without comment, the way one walks beside an old friend with a limp. She was by every measure on every yard surveyor's slate, the most damaged vessel of the Terran gun line ever to remain in action. She was also, and this was the thing the Hollow Reaches never afterward forgot, in action. When a scatter of fleeing votive rams, 11 of them, running for the western lane with their crew's faith broken down to animal flight, cut too close to the evacuation's tail at 1940 that evening, the door's challenge went out across the open band in the dry voice of Captain Elias Ward, offering them, in order, an escorted surrender, a clear lane out of the strait, and the third option. 9 took the lane. 2, in some last guttering of the creed, turned toward the refugees instead. Mule fired twice that watch. Cavett Rin called both loads himself, his voice a handrail in the dark of the can, and felt the great gun lunge against its paths under his hands. And afterward, in the ringing quiet, the Meridian boy in the loader's cage, 8 days aboard, soot to the eyebrows, Ives's rack tape in his pocket because he had asked shyly to keep it, looked up at the second seat and said, "7 for 7, gun captain?" with the question mark still attached, and Birch answered from the trainer's station before Cavett could. 9 for 9, son. The gun doesn't start over because the watch changes. Log it. The first-line fleet came down the northern lane at 0226 on the 33rd day, 81 warships of Terra with their battle ensigns lit, decelerating through the wreck-strewn approaches of the Velic Cross in a formation that came apart, ship by ship, as their crews got their first long-range optics on what filled the strait. Cavett was on the gun deck galleries when the Relief's vanguard made contact, and so he witnessed the exchange that entered the official record, and then within a month every mess hall in the Terran Navy. The Vanguard's flag, a fleet carrier whose name he never learned, hailed on the line's own band, and the hail was not a Navy signal at all, just a human voice, unsteady with what its instruments were showing it, saying, Culverin, Culverin, this is the Relief. We are reading 900+ enemy wrecks in the strait and your transponder in the middle of them. Confirm status." And Culverin's reply, logged at 0231, dry as dust, in the voice of a captain who had not slept more than 3 hours in any 24 for a month. "Relief, Culverin. Status. The door is shut. You're late, but we kept your supper warm. Crossing control to your signal in figures 30 minutes. Be advised, the water here takes some learning." What the first-line fleet found when it closed the crossing point was photographed by 11 different ships, and one of those photographs, Culverin from 3 kilometers off her port beam, scorched, listing, hold, her remaining turrets still trained outward along the lanes, framed against the burning bones of the font of embers with the dead stars beyond, became within a year the most reproduced image in the history of the Reaches. Printed in schoolrooms, etched on memorial walls, hung behind bars in spacer taverns, on 40 worlds under a single caption that needed no explanation anywhere humans or their allies drew breath. The door that refuses. The fleet's admiral came aboard at 0900 with her staff, and the Cythari Accord's own liaison commodore came with her, and Cavett stood in the ranks of the gun deck division at quarters while the brass walked the ship and watched the faces of beings who commanded 81 warships go quiet, deck by deck, as Culverin taught them what arithmetic looked like after the equals sign. The admiral stopped at frame 82, where the bulkhead scorch from Ives's last 14 seconds had been left unpainted by ship's order, already, forever. She read the small plate the gun deck had welded there. She was a woman with 30 years and 4 wars on her shoulders, and she put her palm flat against the burned steel for a moment and said nothing at all, and that, Cavett understood by then, was the highest decoration the line knew how to award. The Cythari Commodore found Cavett afterward at the foot of turret 3, almost exactly where a green levy loader had once stood with a transfer chit while a stretcher went by. Loader Third Class Cavet Rin. The Commodore's membranes were trembling, Cavet could hear it in his vowels, and the datapad in his hands carried the Accord's crest. I have the honor, and I want you to understand in 200 years of the levy, no one has ever had this particular honor before, of informing you that you have been cited by name in a Terran fleet dispatch. Also that your levy obligation is fulfilled as of this month. Also that the Accord is prepared to repatriate you with a hero's pension. Also that there are, as of this morning, 400 Sathari youths at the Orchard Habitat's recruiting station citing your name, and the recruiters are asking what we wish to tell them. The trembling in his vowels got worse, and I find, Loader, that before I transmit any reply, I had to come and look at this ship, and now I have looked at her, and I no longer know what to tell anyone. So I am asking the only Sathari who has stood aboard the door. What is it, this thing the humans have? What do I write home? Cavet looked up at Mule's scorched barbette, at the patched plate, at the white stenciled name older than he was. He thought of his grandmother's hands over her ears, and of the names on the breech ring, and of fire, water, air, structure, in that order, and of a mug of terrible coffee put down in front of him without a word. Write them the truth, he said at last. Write that the fire came, and the humans were not braver than us, or harder than us, or angrier than us. Write that they have simply decided altogether a long time ago that the door stays shut, and then they built their ships and their guns and their suppers and their jokes, and their whole lives in the shape of that decision. It isn't a secret, Commodore. They'll teach it to anyone who stands a watch with them. They taught it to me. His own membranes were trembling now, and for once in his life he let them be heard. Write that 400 is not enough. Tell the recruiters to send the youths to the gun line, and tell their mothers their children will be standing on the right side of the door. Signed, the Loader of Turret 3. The burials were held on the 35th day before the tow ships came, in the oldest tradition of the line. Not committed to the void by tube, Culverin had had a month of the void. She was full to her keel with it, but carried home in her own magazines. Every one of the 91 racked in honor where the shells had been, because the gun deck had voted on that too, and the vote had been unanimous, and the signals sent to the families of the dead said what it had said for 41 years of the ship's life. Your Sondater's shipmate fed the gun. The gun remembers. The ship brings them home herself. And on the evening of the 35th day, in the soot-streaked can of Turret 3, with the watch secured and the straight quiet, and the relief fleet's lights strung along the lanes like a harvest festival, the crew of Mule held the only ceremony Cavet Rin ever saw the gunline conduct in full. There were no officers present, because it was not the Navy's ceremony. There was no chaplain, because it was not a church's. There was the gun, and there was the crew, and there was Chief Gunner's mate Rowan Halloran, discharged from the casualty bay against medical advice, with his burned eyes bandaged and his hand on Decker's shoulder for pilotage, carrying the small worn engraving kit that had cut every name on the breech ring for 11 years. He cut Ives's name first, working entirely by touch, his fingertips reading the bright edges of the letters as he made them, and no one breathed loudly, and when it was done, Ives M. She fed the gun. He rested those huge hands flat on the breech for a long moment, the gesture Cavet had seen on his very first day, the draft animal gentleness, goodbye. Then he held the kit out into the silence in the wrong direction at first until Birch's hand guided his wrist, and what he said was, "Gun Captain, your breech." Chief Cavet's collar clicked and failed. He tried again. "Halloran, it should be your hand." "It was always your hand." "It was always the gun captain's hand," Halloran said. 11 years, that was me. "As of 0716 on the 31st, on the log under the captain's signature, it's you, and a chair only seats one, and my eyes have taken their pension, Loader, even if the rest of me hasn't signed yet." The bandaged face turned toward him, unerring, the way the blind man's voice had been unerring in the smoke. "You'll cut every name this gun costs from here on. That's what the chair is. I've told you the first day, she was right and she was wrong. Nobody relieves anybody on this deck. We just keep the watch warm for whoever the gun calls next. It called you. I heard it do it, son, 30 days ago from the bottom of a ladder, in 2 stones knocking together." He pressed the kit into Cavet's 4-fingered, double-thumbed hands and closed them around it. "Cut clean. The gas polishes everything in the end, so make the edges proud while you can." So Cavet Rin cut, while the crew of mules stood around him in the amber light. Decker, Birch, the Meridian boy, the old chief with his ruined eyes, and the letters came out clean and proud, in the Terran alphabet, in the formula of the line, on a breech ring carrying 41 years of the only theology the gun deck had ever needed. And below all the names of the humans who had taught the galaxy that some doors do not open, there was room remaining, exactly as the captain had promised the boarders, and there always would be. The tow ships took Culverin off the line on the 40th day, And the strangest part of leaving the Velic Cross, Kvet found, was that the cross no longer needed them in order to be safe. And somehow that was the hardest thing of the whole campaign to learn how to feel. Two of the first line's monitors took the crossing watch, Culverin's own sisters, Falconet and Petard, younger ships with their paint unscorched. And as the tow got underway, the two of them rendered honors in the manner of the gun line, which is to say without a single word on any channel. Ships trained their full batteries to salute elevation as the old door passed between them, held them there for the duration of the transit, and returned them to the watch bearings the moment she cleared the strait. Kvet stood at the gallery rail with most of the off-watch and looked back at the shallows where 91 of his shipmates had bought a number that 3 commissions would later confirm, 0, and beside him Decker watched the dead stars shrink with an expression that on any other being Kvet would have called grief, and what Decker finally said was, "Good water. The next cruise will learn it," which was, from Decker, a love letter. The passage home took 5 weeks, and the 5 weeks were their own strange country. A warship full of people who had been promised their deaths and now had to work out, watch by watch, what to do with the unspent remainder. The Navy, which had bled for 200 years to learn what such weeks were for, kept the rhythm absolutely unchanged. Watches stood, drills run, bright work polished on a ship with holes in her you could fly a shuttle through, and inside that iron rhythm, gently, the crew put itself back together. The Meridian boy learned to sing Sumi's sea songs from a 40-year-old audio file the gun deck had kept, terrible voice and all, and nobody told him to stop. Vasquez taught a Sathari loader the rudiments of reading water, in the simulators, on the off chance the levy ever built monitors of its own. Numbers Obi began without explanation, taking her coffee in the gun deck mess at the hour Kvet came off watch, and over 5 weeks of those coffees, the oldest human aboard and the youngest gun captain in the line built one of those friendships that consist entirely of range tables, dry remarks, and the unsaid. Halloran spent the passage teaching. It was that or the casualty bay's dark, and the chief had made his opinion of the dark known by the second day, so the Navy did the wise thing and rated him what he had been in everything. But paperwork for years, an instructor. He held school in Muleskin every forenoon watch, blind seated in the trainer's chair now, never again in the one that seated only one, and the school was nominally for the turret's new hands, and within a week half the gun deck's junior ratings were finding reasons to be in the barbette trunk at 0900 because nobody alive knew what Roan Halloran knew about feeding a gun, and everybody aboard understood without being told that the line was getting its last full measure of him, and that listening was a way of carrying him. "You'll get my billet posting when we dock," he told Kvet. Somewhere in the 4th week, in the middle of stripping an interlock he could no longer see and reassembling it faster than Kvet could follow. Gunnery school, Terra. Mars orbit, actually. They give the blind instructors the simulator wings, on account of in the simulators everybody's equally blind. The flat voice did not change, which was how Kvet knew to listen hardest. 41 years, loader. Man and boy. I came up a ladder barefoot once myself, you know. Different war. Same gun, near enough. The interlock seated, torqued, checked twice. I'll tell you the thing I never told Ives, since the gap polishes everything and in the end. The chair was never the best seat. The best seat is the one I'm in now. Close enough to hear the gun fed right, far enough that it's somebody else's name on the log. You gave me that seat, son. Sathari levy, green as orchard fruit, 30 days from chit to chair, and the gun never fed better than it fed at 729 on the 31st. A pause, 1 salvo long. That's not a compliment, that's a gunnery assessment. I don't give compliments. I know, Chief, Kvet said. I've read your assessments of me. The bandaged face turned toward him, and the scarred mouth under it did something it almost never did, and Halloran said cheeky, with enormous satisfaction, and went back to the interlock. They came into Terra's yards on a gray orbital morning, with half the home fleet's small craft swarming out to meet them, and the homecoming of Culverin was a thing Kvet watched mostly from inside his own astonishment. He had assumed, all the levy assumed, that the humans' regard for the ship was a Reaches phenomenon, a frontier gratitude, and instead the oldest, richest, safest worlds of the species turned out by the 100 million to watch a scorched monitor with a 4-degree list creep into dock under tow. School children had memorized the names of her turrets. The fleet auctioned nothing and scrapped nothing. Every burned plate the yard cut off her was claimed by museums, by memorial commissions, by the families of the dead, by the governments of the hollow reaches, who built the largest piece, a slab of frame 82, into the wall of their new parliament with the scorch outward, under glass, lit day and night. And at the change of command pier, on the day the ship's company was read out for decoration, Kvet Rin learned what the humans had decided his own part meant. He had expected at most the campaign ribbon every hand received. Instead, the citation read out over the assembled division, drafted, he learned later, in the gun deck mess, and forwarded up the chain with every chief's signature on it, which in the line carried more weight than any admiral's, named him to the Terran Navy Cross, the first non-human so decorated, for actions including assumption of command of a main battery turret under fire. And the sentence in the citation that the news feeds reprinted across 2 species worth of space was the sentence the chiefs had fought to keep in, over the objections of 3 successive staff editors. In the judgment of the gun deck, which is the only judgment a gun deck recognizes, the gun called him and he answered and the door stood. He fed the gun remembers. His grandmother did not live to read it. The word from home, when it caught up with the ship's mail, was 11 weeks old. She had died in her sleep in the orchard habitat's long autumn, the season of the threshing songs, while her grandson was somewhere in the dark between the Cross and Terra. And the last message she had recorded for him, before the battle, before the citation, when all she knew was that he was levy crew on a human warship somewhere forward, was 40 seconds long, and was mostly the sound of wind in the orchard rows and ended, "They tell me the humans put their dead's names on the guns." Good. That is the correct theology, Cavett. A name should be somewhere it will be held. When the fire comes, and it always comes, little one, that is the only sermon I know. Stand behind the people who write names on their guns. He played it 4 times, alone, in the empty can of turret 3, in the dock quiet that was the only true silence the gun had ever held. Then he took out the engraving kit that was his now, and below the formula of the line in small clean letters, in 2 alphabets, the Terran one the gas would polish, and the Sathari one that no one aboard but he could read, he cut one more name onto the breech ring of a Terran railgun. The name of an old woman who had taught a child the enemy's hymns, so that her people would never again mistake the sound of fire for the sound of weather. Nobody ever asked him to remove it. The first time Halloran's successor as division chief ran fingertips over the unfamiliar letters during an inspection, the man paused, worked out roughly what it had to be, said family, and when Cavett said, "The first watch I ever stood under," the chief nodded the way the line nodded at correct procedure, wrote nothing on his slate, and moved on, and from then on the gun deck's new hands were simply taught as plain fact, in the flat voice the deck used for its theology. Mule carries 41 years of the line and 1 Sathari grandmother, and the gun remembers all of them the same. The war did not so much end as fail to find a way to continue. The procession of the last ember had been the kindled church, state treasury, and God in one formation, and the rite that was meant to consecrate its triumph had instead been answered, in front of the whole watching galaxy, by a single door that refused. And faiths of that shape, the Navy scholars wrote afterward, do not survive their own arithmetic becoming a joke told in taverns. The scattered hulls that fled the cross dissolved into the dark margins of the map. Some surrendered and were settled, under watch, on quiet worlds, where within a generation their children were uncovering at the names of Terran, monitors like everyone else's children. Some kept the old hymns alive in fragments in hiding, and the fragments grew strange and small. No votive fire was ever again lit in formation. The ledger of fuel was never again added to. 6 worlds of glass kept their silence. Every world after them kept its weather. And 11,000 kilometers of moving water between 2 dead stars became, in the slow way of such things, the most famous strait in 2-species space. The place every gunline crew now learned by simulator before they learned anything else. The subject of the painting that hung, true to the Admiral's silence, without any caption at all in the Navy's oldest academy hall. The destination of a steady pilgrimage of civilian hulls, whose passengers, crossing the shallows in perfect safety on their way to somewhere else, would crowd the viewports at the crossing point to look at nothing, at clean black water where the wrecks had long since been swept, where the lanes hummed with grain and ore and mail, where the only monument was a single navigation beacon the Reaches had paid for, transmitting on the old traffic band, in every levy language, and in Terran the same 9 words on a loop forever, the door held here. It is holding still, pass. 9 years after a stretcher with a flag on it passed a green Sathari at the foot of a turret ladder, the Terran line monitor Culverin, rebuilt, rearmed, her scorches preserved under sealant, where the yard could manage it, and her list corrected over the gun deck's formal written protest, stood the crossing watch at the Velik Cross, and her turret 3 was commanded by Chief Gunner's mate Cavett Rin, and on a quiet forenoon, in the middle of an uneventful commission, a replacement reported to his gun. Cavett heard the boots on the ladder before the hatch moved, and knew everything he needed to know from the rhythm of them. Too careful, too evenly spaced, the climb of someone who had read the ladder's safety placard and was following it exactly. He did not smile, because the chair did not smile at that, but something in both his hearts leaned forward. The human who came up through the hatch was perhaps 19 standard, with a kit bag, a transfer chit held in front of her like a shield, and a face scrubbed so clean of expression that the terror underneath it was published to the whole can. Her coverall said Okonkwo T, and Cavett had read the personnel file and knew the T stood for temperance, and knew whose grandniece she was, and knew she had requested this billet, this ship, this turret, over the written advice of a recruiter who had told her the door was no place to start. She saluted the wrong thing first, the breech, not the chair, which the gun deck would tease her about for exactly 1 year and then defend her over for the rest of her career, because in the deck's considered theology, she had in fact saluted the senior officer present. Order 3rd Class Okonkwo reporting, she managed. Accord, I mean Navy. Posting Order 7-11, Chief. The can was quiet around her in the way Cavett remembered from the inside. Decker, Senior Chief Decker now, master of the deck, improbably more vast, motionless in the rammer's well. The trainer and gunner watching with the studied indifference of crews everywhere. And on the breech ring between them all, polished by 9 more years of gun gas, the rows of small clean names that she was visibly trying not to look at and visibly unable to stop looking at. Cavett came down out of the chair. He took the chit, read it without hurry, and then stood in front of her, slight, gray, four-fingered, the first alien ever to captain a gun of the Terran line, with the ribbon she had memorized from her schoolbooks, worn faded and crooked because Ives had once told him decorations sat crooked on everyone honest. And he asked her the question Numbers Obi had asked him across a dead reckoning plot a war ago, loader. Tell me what a gun is. He watched her fight her way past the manual answer, the schoolbook answer, the answer her aunt's stories had salted her with. Watched her glance, helpless, at the names on the breech. Watched her give up on cleverness entirely, which was the only door the question had. I don't know, Chief, she said. Yet. Correct, said Cavett Rin, and put the chit in his pocket, and pointed one double-thumbed hand at the loader's cage, at the worn place on the rail where 3 sets of hands had polished the metal pail, Sumarno's and his own and 4 loaders since. That's the cage. By the end of the commission you'll hate it, then you'll miss it the rest of your life. We drill at 6. Stand there. Put your hands on the rail. She stood there. She put her hands on the rail. And Cavett watched the thing happen that always happened. The thing that had happened to him barefoot in his sleeping fur. The thing Halloran, retired now, ashore on Mars, writing gunnery texts in a flat, blunt prose the academies could not bring themselves to edit. Still called, in his letters, the only sacrament I ever witnessed that worked every time. The green replacement shoulders dropped half a centimeter. The borrowed look left her hands, and the gun, patient, warm from the morning's drills, 41 plus 9 years old, and not done, took the measure of its newest pair of hands and began without a sound to teach. Welcome to Mule, Cavett said. Nobody here gets relieved. You get a place. You'll see the difference. The commission was, by the standards of the watch the line kept now, quiet. The lanes hummed. The convoys ran, grain and ore and mail and pilgrims, and twice a year the slow festival traffic from the reaches, whose every hull still cleared its outbound song with traffic control and a ritual nobody could quite explain to outsiders. One verse of anything at all, sung by the crew themselves, machine-clean channels be damned. Because the cross had a tradition now that the only voices in its water should be living ones. The dead stars braided their tides, and the quartermasters read them, and new hands learned the water the way Vasquez show, Lieutenant Vasquez show these days. Master of the Straits Pilot School insisted it could only be learned, which was humbly. And once in that commission, only once, the long instruments in the loft picked up something at the far northern margins of the deep water. A contact, then 3, then 11, cold running and hull down among the rogue ice, pacing the straits approaches the way a thing paces that is deciding whether to test a door. The signatures matched nothing in the current registries, and matched something very well in the old ones. Votive hulls. Last fragments of the fragments, 2 generations gone to seed in the dark margins and grown strange, and aboard Culverin without alarms, without drama, in the unhurried rhythm of a deck going about scheduled work. The watch changed, the rails ran out, and the door made its presence formally known in the manner Captain Ward had retired into legend. A single unencrypted transmission on the old traffic band, in the kindled's own liturgical mode, composed years before by the only being in the Navy fluent in both the language and the theology, and held on file for exactly this contingency. Cavett had written it himself. It was 1 verse long. It was the Navy's linguist certified, grammatically flawless ceremonial kindled, and it was set. This was the part the gun deck loved. The part that made it theirs, to the tune of a Sathari threshing song, the one for the year's last harvest. Translated, it said, the water is kind, the lanes are open, and trade is welcome, the door is shut. Ask the Fawn of Embers, ask the 6 worlds of glass what knocking costs. Then come through honestly in the light, as friends do, or go and tell the dark margins what you saw here. The gun is fed, the names are bright, and the watch does not end. The 11 contacts held station among the ice for 19 hours, listening to the most heavily armed lullaby and two-species space repeat on the half-watch. Then they went away, northward, hull down, and they did not come back, and no votive hull was ever seen in the approaches of the Velik Cross again. The loft logged it as contact resolved, cause, arithmetic. The gun deck logged it differently, in the unofficial deck log that the Navy pretended not to know about and quietly archived in triplicate. Old customers looked in the window, read the menu, couldn't afford it, mule didn't even wake up. Loader Okonkwo stood her first real alert through all 19 of those hours, in the cage, with shaking hands and a steady voice, calling her trays clear, and afterward, when the rails were housed and the cans secured, she looked up at the chair with her aunt's level eyes in her young face and asked the question every loader eventually asked, the one the whole rotation existed to answer. Chief, if they had come, the 11 of them, against just us, a swallow, could we really have held? And Chief Gunners Might Cavet Rin, gun captain of Turret 3, who had been green once and a replacement once and was now neither and would never be, either again looked around the can, at Decker, monumental and content, at the worn rail, at the names Sumarno and Ives and Obi, who had died ashore full of years with a range table on her lap, and the small Sathari letters no inspection had ever questioned, and gave the only answer the chair had ever given, the one Halloran had given him, with his hands over a frightened recruits on a loading tray, the one the line had been giving the dark for 200 years, flat, level, certain, a handrail in any night. Loader, the door doesn't hold because the enemy is small. It holds because the watch is kept. They kept it. He touched the breech ring, the bright edges, and the polished ghosts together. We keep it. You're keeping it right now. That's the whole sermon, and you stood it shaking, which is the only way anyone ever stands it the first time, and tomorrow we drill at 6. She slept that night the way he had slept after the Rams. Badly, then deeply, then waking once with her arms cradling a shell that was not there, to the sound of a senior chief in the next compartment saying, without opening his eyes, the absolution of the deck, tray clear, go back to sleep, loader. And the watch went on, and the lanes hummed, and at the crossing point of the Velik Strait between two dead stars, in moving water she had been drinking for half a century, the old door rode her tides with her guns trained easy along the roads of the living, while inside her, in a soot-sweet turret with one word stenciled on its barbette, the next pair of hands learned the rhythm, and the next, because Ives had been right the first morning and right forever. Nobody is ever relieved on the gun deck of the line. There is only the place, and the watch, and the names cut proud while the edges can still be felt, and the gas polishes everything in the end, and the gun remembers anyway. The gun remembers. That was the theology complete, and Cavet Rin had crossed 1,200 light years and paid the full tuition to learn it. And it could be carried in 9 words, and it was carved over the gate of the gunnery school on Mars, now in a blind man's blunt lettering, and it was the last thing Cavet thought every time the hatch opened on a new pair of careful boots, every commission, every year, for all the years the line gave him. The fire always comes, the door is always shut, and whoever climbs that ladder green and barefoot, carrying nothing but a chit and a duffel, and a name no one aboard can pronounce. The gun will call them, and the crew will make a place. And the place will hold, because the price is paid in every generation, gladly, by hands that learn it one tray at a time. The watch does not end. The names stay bright, the door holds still, pass.